Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
It's great talking to an audience of governance professionals who have spent 18 months perfecting the art of being on and off mute at the right time, and then I get it wrong. So apologies for that. Good morning. Welcome to our summer term Clerking Network meeting. My name's Steve Edmonds. I'm NGA's Director of Advice and Guidance, and I'm joined by a number of colleagues from NGA today, some of whom you'll be hearing from, others who are supporting behind the scenes. My colleague Charlotte is on presentation slide duty this morning, and I'm going to ask Charlotte to move us on, if that's okay, to the next slide, please. So I should also add a big thank you to you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us this morning. I'm sure and hope that you'll find it worthwhile. So this is the agenda we have for you this morning, and as you will see, most of the meeting is devoted to the launch of our report, School and Trust Governance Professionals 2021 and Beyond. That report has been launched this morning, and we're very much looking forward to discussing that with you and a panel of distinguished guests. You'll also see that we have a message from Baroness Berridge, who is the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the school system, and she has a message especially for our clerk and governance professionals community, which we're pleased to share as part of this meeting. We have other update items as well, and I'm sure it will be a very positive and productive morning. So could we just move on, please, to the next slide? A few moments on the etiquette for today's meeting, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with by now. If you could just ensure that your mic is on mute, unless you're invited to unmute and take part in the discussion. But please, and we absolutely mean this, do make the best use of the chat function throughout the event. It's a great opportunity to talk to us and talk to each other about what you're hearing, share your thoughts, and lived experience. It really is what makes these events what they are. The presentation slides will be emailed to you later this week, and the recording will be available and shared after the event as well. And because the chat is such an important fundamental part of the event, we obviously give you the opportunity to download that at the end of the session, so we don't bring it to an abrupt end. You'll have the opportunity to save the chat and relive the chat at your own convenience. So if we don't mind moving on to the next slide, please, Charlotte. Of course, it would not be an NGA meeting or event without us taking the opportunity to update you on the development of our services for you. And I'm going to start with Learninglink, which, as you all know, is our rich and varied collection of quality e-learning for governors, trustees, and indeed governance professionals. And if you've engaged with Learninglink, you'll know, and I'm sure endorse the positive feedback that we receive, both on the quality and the affordability. But we don't rest on our laurels. Our offer continues to be refreshed. And Charlotte, if you don't mind moving us on to the next slide, we're pleased to announce the addition of some content to support governance professionals in managing exclusion panel meetings, which we know, is a really important part of your role and something that our governing boards rely very heavily upon you to help us get it right. So we're very pleased today to have launched a module that comprehensively explains how panel chairs, clerks, governance professionals, panel members are involved in each stage of the process, and it also provides some useful examples and questions to ask. So please do take a look at that and let us know what you think. We've also launched modules recently on staff workload and well-being, which we know is very much a strategic priority for all schools and trusts at this moment in time, and stakeholder engagement. So, as I say, that collection of e-learning, that rich and varied content continues to grow and evolve, and please do signpost your governing boards to it. Charlotte, if you don't mind moving us on, and I'm going to continue with the theme of CPD and touch briefly on our clerks, NGA's Clerks Development Programme. You'll know that sadly, DFE funding for the National Clerks Development Programme recently came to an end. However, we continue our commitment to this programme and to offering the level 3 accreditation. And for those wishing to self-fund, the cost is there on the slide, and the cohort is now open for a September start. We'll be opening for further registering for further cohorts soon, and the details are there on the slide, and you can get more information from our website or indeed by emailing the team, details of which are on the slide which you'll receive. Charlotte, do you mind moving us on, if that's okay? And those who again follow NGA will know that this is our year of visible governance, and it's amazing to think that we're now halfway through this year. We've packed so much in so far, including a month that was dedicated to governance professionals in March, and indeed there is still more to come, including our Outstanding Governance Awards in September. This campaign means a great deal to us because it's about elevating school governance and giving it the prominence and status that it truly deserves. But it's also a campaign, what we make of it, really. So as the slide says there, do yourselves and please do encourage your governing boards to get involved by promoting the contribution they make to their schools and their communities, and you can find more information about our visible governance campaign on our website. Charlotte, I'll just ask you to move on if you don't mind. Well, this is very exciting. We've just started, as I'm sure you'll know, running governance live sessions to help those who have just started their governance journey and who are on governing boards that have NGA Gold membership get to grips with their role and make a difference, particularly in the first 6 months. So these live sessions, I should add, have been designed specifically to complement the local induction that governors and trustees receive, either through their trust or through local authorities or providers. So it's not an alternative to induction. It's a really effective complementary session which will get your new governors and trustees thinking and really galvanise them into action over the first few months. So if you are fortunate enough to have NGA Gold membership, which is in itself is extremely good value, then please do signpost your governors and trustees to these live sessions. We started the programme yesterday, actually, with our Welcome to Governance live session for maintained school governors, and we're running further sessions for different governing structures throughout this month and next month, with more to come. So, please do join us in this exciting journey. Charlotte, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide. That's me rattling through our service developments, and there'll be more to come on that when Ella joins us later. But right now, I'm going to hand over to our Clerk Development Manager, Amy Wright, who's going to look back briefly on a successful clerking conference which we held in March. So Amy, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone who attended the conference back in March, and also for the feedback that you gave in the questionnaire afterwards. It's great to hear all your opinions and suggestions and ideas. There were some very interesting comments and much food for thought, particularly for my role being new, and how I might be able to develop that role to best support you all. It was wonderful that so many of you were able to join us, many for the first time, because the conference was held online. So we had no hesitation in holding today's network meeting online, but plenty of people did note that they enjoy the face-to-face events and recognise the opportunities which can be gained from impromptu conversations when getting a cup of tea or having lunch with people. So obviously this is something we will consider in the future when we're able to return to face-to-face events, and how best to accommodate as many of you as possible, perhaps with some kind of hybrid version of in person and also being able to hook up online. I'm not going to go into many of the points raised by you at the conference, because the majority of them are covered in the report presentation coming up next. But there were some interesting nuggets, such as the timings of the conference, and indeed many of our events, which for some fell in the Easter holidays last time, but for others were during term time, because of the differences in variations in different parts of the country and in various designations of schools where perhaps the local diocese may influence when Easter and Christmas holidays fall. So for some governance professionals, it did make it easier for them to attend because it was during the holidays. For others, it didn't. And we do recognise that, unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll ever be able to find a date and time which will suit everyone. But we hope that if the timing of one of our events is not good for you, then perhaps you'll be able to join us for the next one and still be able to be part of our network. The chat facility was mentioned in the feedback from the conference. It was well used there, with questions posed, answers given, and advice and guidance thrown in. And it was lovely to see all the hints and tips that people were able to share. And people recognised it as the alternative to face-to-face networking, and mostly were happy to use it. So I do hope you will use it today, but please feel free to turn it off or hide it if you find it a distraction, as some people did. You may, however, find it useful to save the chat, as we've already said. Please do click on the 3 dots at the bottom right-hand corner and select save chat at the end, and there will be time to do that. There might be some differences on tablets, I'm not sure. It was helpful to know that the content of the conference was much appreciated and appealing to the majority of attendees, although obviously some people got more out of certain aspects than others, which is fine. It looked as though across the board we managed to have at least something that was useful to every one of you. And thank you for your suggestions regarding improvements to the event and what content could be covered at future events. These include things like having a regular slot for the Department for Education and including legal updates, information on NGA online training specifically for governance professionals, as we've mentioned, the Learninglink module that's been launched today. Training webinars also came up, again specifically for governance professionals, and also more opportunities to share best practice, including suggestions for local clerking and network meetings. So we shall be looking at all that, or continue to look at all that, and see how we can help and support you in those things. And we love to get your comments and suggestions and ideas, and we continue to review our offer in light of both the conference chat that we had, and obviously the feedback from the survey and the report findings that you're going to hear about shortly. But thank you again for your participation, for then and for joining us today. And I hope you enjoy it. And please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have anything else to say about it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Right, Charlotte, if you don't mind moving us on to the next slide. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Sam Trenter, who is our Senior Advice Officer, and who is going to take us through, or start taking us through, the findings of our survey into the career landscape for governance professionals 2021 and beyond. So I look forward to hearing from you, Sam, and hearing about the report.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Welcome everyone. Charlotte, in fact, if we can move on to the next one straight away, please. Brilliant. So I'll begin by outlining the purpose of the report, the purpose of the survey behind it, and the report that we've published today. So a little bit about the intent. What we wanted to do with this report was to establish an accurate picture of the career landscape for clerks and other governance professionals as it stands. We also wanted to provide important context to ongoing debates surrounding the evolution of governance professional roles. Those debates take place in forums such as this one, but that also refers to conversations that the department is having. The backdrop to this is that the DfE has established its own project group on which NGA is represented to support its work on elevating the status of governance support. But also it refers to conversations between practitioners and their employers and the governing boards they serve. So with all those things in mind, finally, what we wanted to do was to identify opportunities and potential solutions to support practitioners and develop the profession. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So a little bit to begin with on who responded to the survey. We received 1,272 responses. And I've included there one of the charts from the report that breaks down who those people are by job title. So you'll see that a majority of respondents were clerks to school governing boards or academy committees or LGBs, and a further 14% were clerks to trust boards. Then a much smaller number occupied other governance professional roles, variously described as governance manager or head of governance or director of governance. And respondents also used the other option to tell us that they were company secretaries or that they were in officer roles unique to respective organizations, or that their job titles were slight variations on the options provided. So it's important to bear in mind that that's still a relatively small self-selecting sample of a workforce that we estimate to be in the region of 10,000 people. And obviously something else to bear in mind is that overall responses are weighted, as you can see, towards the views of clerks. But you'll see when you read the report that responses are examined by role throughout the report, and the differences between those roles are reported where possible. Next slide, please, Charlotte. We also asked respondents who they were employed by. So you'll see a fairly small number of freelancers and those working for independent service providers. The most popular response was that, well, the majority were employed directly by the schools or trusts they serve, and a smaller number were employed by local authorities. The yellow bars there represent the results from the last time we conducted this type of survey in 2016, our pay and conditions survey of clerks. So you'll see that I think it was a 12% reduction in the number being employed by schools or trusts directly, and a 12% gain in the local authority area. Those differences aren't necessarily a trend. We may just be looking here at different people responding to the survey, but that's interesting when you consider the growth in the number of academies, and in some areas the depletion of governor services within local authorities. So that was an interesting finding. We also found that the majority worked part-time. In fact, less than 20% told us they're in their roles full-time. Next slide, please, Charlotte. We also discovered that respondents arrived at the profession from a wide variety of employment backgrounds. A number were previously linked to the school sector or had prior experience in other administrative, secretarial, or legal roles. 12% had experience of school or academy trust governance, for example, by having served as a governor or a trustee. But a great many others told us that they had no prior links to the school sector whatsoever, being previously employed in other areas of the public sector, such as the NHS or civil service, or having occupied various roles in the private and third sectors. I've included this chart here to show the answers to the question of whether or not respondents had provided their services as governance professionals in another sector. I'll save you from scrunching up your eyes to see those figures. It's 81% of respondents told us that they hadn't worked as a governance professional in another sector, but a few percent told us that they'd worked in further education, the higher education sector, the charity sector, the private sector, and the public sector as well, for example, in local government. But basically this tells us something about how accessible the profession is. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So on to the key findings of the survey. And we begin with what is the most predictable one for many of you. That is that there are deep-rooted issues with pay and recognition. The profession is underpaid, especially for clerks. Next slide, please, Charlotte. A bit of background to our work on pay. I'm sure many of you will be aware that in 2020, last year, we released a report called Putting a Price on Effective Clerking. What that report did, and for the research behind it to begin with, it responded to evidence that a significant number of governance professionals were not being paid at an appropriate level or even for all of the hours they worked. So in terms of method, we embarked on market pricing and job evaluation type exercises, including recruiting the help of an expert steering panel. And we arrived at the conclusion that those clerking a single governing board should receive no less than between £12.85 and £14.74 per hour. That's based on the level of experience involved and how that's applied. So a bit of context there for those of you that didn't have that figure in mind already. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Another bit of context is we asked respondents to tell us in the survey what motivated them to first enter the profession. And basically what we found is we can't be shy about the fact that the primary motivation was to gain additional income. Sorry, this is the single most important factor here. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So we asked respondents to provide us with their hourly rate or equivalents, and this information was disclosed by approximately half of those surveyed. We found that although a number of hourly rates are aligned with NGA's recommended minimum rate for clerking a single governing board, the majority of respondents operating at the clerking level, so it was 58%, are still being paid below that amount. There are also regional variations. I'm sure that won't come as too much of a surprise. For example, no one working in London reported that they earned the equivalent of between £7 and £9.99 per hour, whereas a quarter of those who fell within that £7 to £9.99 range were located in the East Midlands. So huge regional disparities. We knew this already. As expected, there was also a huge increase in the earning potential of other governance professionals. Possible explanations for this pattern include increased scope for line management responsibilities within wider governance support teams, in MATS, for example, but also elsewhere. And it was also the case that other governance professionals were more likely to report that they had worked as governance professionals in another sector. Going back to that chart that I previously showed you, therefore increasing opportunities to gain a wider range of knowledge, skills, and experience linked to the possibility of higher rates of pay. Some more findings on pay we've got listed here. Although 61% stated an intention to continue in their current roles, the remainder told us for various reasons that they would consider leaving, and low pay and lack of understanding as to what the role entails are among the reasons for wanting to leave the profession. We also discovered that the vast majority of those who gained a qualification, those people were not rewarded with a pay increase. They did acknowledge benefits other than pay, but told us it was not linked to an increase in pay. And another interesting finding was that rates of pay were affected by who these were set by. We discovered that those respondents who set their own rate of pay were more likely to earn the minimum figure recommended by NGA. On the other hand, those whose pay was set by the lead executive of the organisation in question, or the governing board, or the employer, whether that was the local authority or an independent service provider, those people were up to 3 times more likely to be paid below the figure recommended by NGA. So there's definitely a conversation that needs to be had there. We've also got some findings from NGA's annual governance survey, and it's fair to say that these unacceptably low levels of pay could explain why, at the time of writing this particular report, a quarter of respondents to NGA's annual governance survey had reported difficulty in recruiting a governance professional. It's not hard to arrive at the conclusion that perhaps it's not being made attractive enough in terms of pay and reward. However, the main purpose of this report was to look beyond pay and conditions to the issue of professional identity and practices as a means of responding to concerns about recognition. Charlotte, could you move us on, please? So another key finding was that the support for using the term governance professional as an umbrella term for all professional roles supporting and advising school and trust governing boards. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Here we have the question as it was posed in the survey and the results. So as I said, here, the question was, which of the following statements best reflects your views of using the term governance professional? And we clarified that here, governance professional is a collective description or umbrella term for all those individuals paid to support and advise governing boards. The options given were yes, for a number of reasons, including it would elevate status, it would unite all of those working in these roles under one term. We gave the option to say, no, I would not support this because I believe the title clerk carries enough status. I don't believe a clerk is a governance professional. There's no need for a collective description, or that you would be unsure what this would achieve. If we move on to the next slide, please, Charlotte. The responses to this question, bearing in mind we gave respondents the opportunity to include their own comments alongside selecting one of those options. Those responses indicate that some people interpreted this question as a proposal that governance professional be used as a universal job title, which wasn't the case. That's not what was being proposed. This was about acknowledgement of a profession. But we found that the majority of respondents would support use of the term governance professional as a collective description. But also it's clearer than ever that there's an increasingly varied portfolio of governance professional roles in the state school sector. They reflect different governance structures, different levels of support, and different job titles will continue to be needed to distinguish between those roles within the profession. That point was missed by some respondents, but it was that was a common thing we encountered. But what we did receive was a range of valuable comments on appropriate context for using the term governance professional. And practitioners are clear that culture and structure must also evolve in order to increase recognition for the profession and help raise its profile. In other words, what's required is not only a shift in language, but a shift in culture and a review of the framework within which governance professionals operate, including governing boards engaging with the full extent of governance professional roles and not taking those for granted. Therefore, increased recognition requires not only appropriate terminology, but also adoption of the habits and behaviours of a profession. Next slide, please, Charlotte. With that in mind, another focus of the survey was the question of development, and the finding here is that there is insufficient focus on development within the profession. If we move on, Charlotte, I've broken this down into recruitment and induction to begin with. Only a very small minority of those surveyed were required to hold an accreditation or other formal qualification, both initially and following any subsequent performance appraisals. We found that there was very little variation in recruitment requirements applied to those in employed versus self-employed roles. But there was one difference that stood out, and that was that the more time that had passed since respondents first entered the profession, the more likely it was that initial requirements, including qualifications, were stipulated. What this reveals is a downward trend in the level of expectation attached to the role by employers at the point of recruitment. That said, a majority of respondents told us they still chose to undertake qualifications for personal development and to improve their skill sets. The most popular choice being the level 3 qualification. Level 3 certificates accounted for over 70% of the qualifications we were told about. We also posed the question of whether respondents believed that minimum qualification requirements would improve the quality of clerking. A majority of respondents, 59%, told us that they thought it would. That figure rose to 73% amongst those respondents who already possessed a qualification and could therefore attest to the benefits of it. If we move on to the question of, oh no, sorry, Charlotte, if we stick with that, but we cover induction first. Just one more point on the subject of qualifications. Those are interesting findings about the minimum qualification requirements, because respondents who supported use of the term governance professional, they often suggested that this term should only be adopted on completion of a qualification universally recognized as underwriting professional status. And in support of that view, comparisons were drawn with other professions that have minimum qualification requirements. For example, teaching staff requiring qualified teacher status. So if we look at an induction now, we found that over a quarter of respondents were offered no induction training, with significant variations in quality and scope where such training was offered. Induction also included regional variations, possibly reflecting different levels of local authority provision, given the number of comments about LAs being used to source good quality induction training. So that's recruitment and induction. If we move on, please, Charlotte. We also looked at the use of appraisals. We found that the use of appraisals has increased since the last time NGA conducted this type of survey in 2016, but many respondents still do not receive an annual appraisal. It's currently 39%. Where appraisals do take place, almost 3/4 of them are not being used to support conversations about professional development. Comments about appraisal suggest that they often lack formality or structure, making it unsurprising that conversations about development are not taking place in that context. Shortcomings in the use of appraisals are further highlighted by findings from NGA's annual governance survey, early data from which reveals that 35% of respondents to that survey don't know who is responsible for conducting their governance professionals appraisal, with a further 18% confirming that no appraisal takes place. If we could move on, please, Charlotte. So some other training and development findings beyond recruitment induction and appraisal. We asked respondents to rate their levels of confidence in various areas, such as relationship with boards and executives, providing advice and guidance. But we also included identifying appropriate CPD. And that was the area in which respondents were most likely to rate themselves not so confident or not at all confident. We also discovered from many of the comments provided that paid hours do not always cover or account for the time required to undertake CPD, making associated costs difficult to justify and making those conversations with boards and employers difficult to have. We found that many decisions not to pursue qualifications and other training opportunities reflect a lack of perceived pay and progression benefits. For example, over a quarter of those not pursuing accreditations or other formal qualifications explain this by seeing no benefit to doing so. We also discovered that the most common explanation given by those clerking for school governing boards and academic committees for not undertaking further CPD was that it had simply never been considered or suggested by their employers. And if we move on to the next slide, please, Charlotte, I've included a few examples of some of the comments about lack of engagement with schools by boards or by employers with the suggestion of further CPD. So simply not offered or encouraged, no perceived benefit, not only from those thinking about undertaking this kind of training, but also from, in this case, the head teacher, but we heard the same about boards and employers. So that idea about lack of perceived benefit doesn't belong to practitioners themselves. It's not limited to them. It's an attitude that is within boards and schools and other employers as well. As you can see there from the final comment, it's not seen as a priority by the governing board or something that they take an interest in. If we move on, please, Charlotte. We asked the question of whether respondents saw scope for progression in their roles. And only a 13% minority saw scope for progression in their roles. That was the overall figure. And included here is a chart to demonstrate how that varied between roles. So that it falls even lower than 13% for clerks to school governing boards or academic committees, but rose above that figure for all other roles, including clerk to the trust board. So what we have here is a situation where those who have attained more can attest to those opportunities for progression, but those opportunities are clearly lagging in the eyes of clerks who have not experienced that level of attainment, if indeed it's something they aspire to. Next slide, please, Charlotte. We also asked the question of whether respondents believed that there were enough high quality qualifications available. Over a quarter of them told us that they didn't believe that was the case. And to build on this, we asked the question of what levels of qualifications do you feel are currently missing? And we asked, it was a question of basically whether people personally felt they needed this, whether they felt the sector needed these qualifications at various levels, or both, it was needed on both an individual and sector level. To break down some of the results for you, the most popular response in terms of what people believe the sector requires is the level 3 qualification. That reflects how that was the most popular qualification possessed by respondents. So again, attesting to its benefits. But if we switch the focus to what people felt they personally needed and not just what the sector needed, level 4 came out on top. So there's clearly space there for a higher level of qualification presumably on the part of those who have already completed the level 3, given that we learned that 70% have 70% of respondents opted for that particular qualification and have that already. But it's difficult to ignore that huge green bar for I'm unsure what I need. So we know from some of the comments provided that there is uncertainty, or even people simply don't know what qualifications are available, what's out there, what it costs. And we know from the conversations, from the questions about appraisal, that some of that is due to those conversations, those professional conversations about development and qualifications in particular not taking place. But also perhaps it's just simply that information is not known on a personal level, whether or not that's a communication issue is not clear. But clearly it's impossible to ignore just how many people were unsure what they personally required. If I add a bit of context to this question, while 28% told us that they don't believe there are enough high quality qualifications, 33% said they did think there was enough, but the remainder were unsure. So again, it's clear that there's a lot of uncertainty here, and what we saw in the space created by uncertainty as to what the role, qualifications might play, was calls for the development of a career pathway showing the qualifications and relevant CPD governance professionals need to progress their status, their career, and their pay. And I think that has got me to the end of my slides, and is a nice note to leave on for Emma to summarize our conclusions and how to build on these findings. Charlotte, could you just move that on and double check, please, for me? Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I appreciate for those of you listening to that, that's a lot to take in, particularly when it's quite hard to read the axes there. So I hope some of you have managed to get hold of the report while Sam's been talking, so you could follow along in that. And also very shortly, if it's not there already, there will also be a summary. So all that data, what are we going to do about it? Could you move me on, please, Charlotte? Sorry, I should probably say for those of you that don't know me, although it was there on that slide, I am Emma Knights. I'm Chief Executive here at the NGA. And we, of course, have been running the Clerking Matters campaign formally since 2013. So when we began looking at these results with Sam and Amy several weeks ago, a couple of months ago now, we were sort of, do you know what? We're going to be concluding the same things that we concluded after a similar exercise in 2013 and again in 2016. So we need to come up with a way of actually making a difference and moving practice on. So we've really thought hard in the last month about how to do that. We've been talking behind the scenes to key people. Obviously the Department for Education is absolutely one, and you'll be hearing, as Steve said, from the Minister in a moment. But also I've just noticed in the chat someone mentioned the Chartered Governance Institute, and of course we are in conversation with them as well. So these are our expectations on the screen there that we've had for Clerking Matters over all these years. And they are very familiar to you all, about governance professionals being entitled to appropriate CPD, including induction, of course, governance professionals receiving an annual appraisal involving the chair of the governing board, at which CPD is discussed. So that's sort of the starting point for those discussions, or can be the starting point if you haven't started already. That boards need to invest in their governance professionals, and that means both in terms of remuneration, but also hours, which Sam touched on briefly, but we didn't have as much info. We didn't ask as many questions about ours as we have done previously. And lastly, some governing boards, and I did feel necessary to qualify that simply because we don't like at NGA to spend our time simply sort of sitting or standing from on high saying, you know, you should do this, you should do this, and you should do this. There are some boards clearly who deeply value their governance professionals, and we can tell that from the chat we've had in other events, with the number of times that they reference you and the role you're doing and talk about how important the work you are doing is and how you have transformed practice. However, we can't but acknowledge the fact that there are other governing boards who simply don't still understand the scope and the importance of the role of their independent advisor, you know, despite the fact that the role descriptions now have been around for a long time. So we wanted to avoid making those same 4 conclusions that we've made on previous occasions. So although the themes are absolutely writ large, we want to now move forward with a more specific sector-wide proposal, or should I even adopt the language of demands? Can you move me on, please, Charlotte? So that demand I was referring to is that number 2 there on that slide. We think that you as a profession require a career framework that is linked to clear expectations, relevant qualifications, and remuneration. And actually, the very fact that some governing boards have been so slow to implement what we were calling our clerking matter expectations, that's absolutely had a detrimental effect to advancing pay to what we consider appropriate levels. And I do understand, I mean, I think probably, you know, very few organisations understand as well as NGA does the financial pressures on schools, but that absolutely isn't an excuse to not pay your staff fairly. You probably know that NGA this year is emphasising the role of staff. We are in a people business. The more our staff achieve, the better the education for young people. So that includes adequate pay and conditions, as well as good CPD, and also we've had very much an emphasis on staff well-being too. So what we're asking today is all of us involved. So that includes governing boards, yourselves as governance professionals, but also the wider sector, to renew that commitment to implementing those expectations, and to do that collectively. Because if we don't actually start doing it, as opposed to surveying and discussing it, then we are going to be coming back year on year and having these same conversations. And I'm sure a number of you there are saying, look, Emma, we know this better than you do. We keep having these conversations when we network together, but it's very hard to affect change. Can you move me on to the next slide, please? And you would be absolutely right in saying it's hard to affect change. That's the business that NGA is in, and boy, can it be difficult. And that's why we want to have a sort of pincer movement coming from yourselves as the professionals and governing boards, in which we absolutely will be spearheading. You've got our commitment to do that, but we will also be encouraging, I'm going to use that softer word for now, other partners, in particularly the Department for Education, to really make a step change in this. So before we move on to the Minister's thoughts, I just wanted to talk to you as a profession, and I do understand those of you, the sort of minority of you that basically went, well, what would changing the language actually do? And language isn't the be all and end all, but it's quite important. And I think you adopting the language of being a profession will consistently is an important point in terms of being able to say, if we are a profession, then we should have those things that go along with professional status. And that's both in terms of career pathways, with qualifications, but also adequate remuneration. So making those arguments really go hand in hand. And I realize, of course, I am preaching to the converted here, because you are the people turning up. I mean, it is a great attendance, over 300 of you today attending this network, but you are the people that believe absolutely in getting together and networking, and we need to get that message, you know, further and further out across the sector. And also, we probably haven't stressed enough, but I take it on board to do that as well, is that, as you know, we work very closely with the leadership associations, so both ASCL, Association of School or College Leaders, and National Association of Head Teachers, and the Institute of School Business Leaders. And actually getting leadership buy-in is clearly also important. So when I've said very generally here, others in the sector, leaders are clearly a very important other. I just wanted to point out again the information, I think was on one of Sam's previous slides as well, about the lowest pay, because although I said when we looked at the results, we thought, here we go again, there were one or two things that were shocking. I did think the lack of progress in some areas was deeply, I'm wondering whether I should say shocking or not, but certainly of deep concern. But I was absolutely astounded by how many of you are still being paid underneath that minimum level that the report that Sam worked on last year came up with, because I know at the time there was a lot of disappointment about those rates. You had wanted NGA to give a higher figure. So I'm perfectly frank, so did I, but this went through a very professional, extensive process. And it was, remember, looking only at that role that services one governing board or academy committee. So this wasn't about the whole profession, it was about one band of the profession. So those are the figures that we gave as a minimum. So it is shocking what a percentage of people who responded to our survey, and remember there are all of those that are not responding to the survey who are also likely to be in that boat. So please do make use of that to increase the pay, at least from the very bottom. So the conversations that we've been having with the Department of Education for quite a long time now have made a difference over the years. That is where the Clerking Development Programme first came from, which is now under review. And many of us are reminding the department that they do need to make a decision about that, because there's now a gap in the funding there. However, I think that the department is taking this issue, your role, a lot more seriously than it's done previously. And I think you can see that in terms of the content of the Academy Trust Handbook, which will be followed in suit by the Governance Handbook. They do go hand in hand, albeit not always published exactly at the same time. You will have seen that they've also adopted the phrase governance professional throughout the Academy Trust Handbook. They just beat us to it. which I don't know whether to be pleased or slightly irritated that we didn't get there first. And I do want just to put a little bit of a caveat. We will be using, as Sam said, the phrase governance professional for the profession as a whole. There may be times when we continue to use the phrase clerking, particularly as a verb, but also as a job title. So it's going to take us really quite a long time to go through all our material and see what's appropriate. But absolutely, today is the day when NGA also says we will be talking about you all as governance professionals from here on in. I say looking at a slide which has Clerking Network across the top. So there's lots of times we're going to need to think about that. So is adopting that language, is pushing for a career framework, is asking for pay reevaluations. Is it going to make a difference? Let's hear from the Minister and what Baroness Berridge has to say.
Thank you to the NGA for inviting me to say a few words at today's event. One of the good things about virtual events is that I'm able to accept more invitations and speak to larger audiences. So events like this are a great opportunity for me to set out some of my personal priorities, but I do hope, obviously in the future, to be able to meet you in person. So why did I want to say a few words specifically at your event? Well, we know that governance professionals are a fundamental part of a good school and trust governance situation. In their report last year, the National Foundation for Educational Research looked at this. They found that effective use of a governance professional's expertise is one of the key elements of effective governing bodies. And of course, the NGO and others have been saying the same thing for many years. Good governance professionals provide expert organisational support and advice. They can improve a board's efficiency and productivity, and they ensure compliance with regulatory frameworks. They are the go-to person on any procedural matters, and that's invaluable. And yes, I know that the role of the governance professional has too often been overlooked and underappreciated. The NGA's Clerking Matters campaign has been one of the forerunners in this space, and I'm grateful to them for their continued work. The department has also been focusing on what we can do to strengthen the role of the governance professional. We know that not all organisations recognise the value of a governance professional and the value they can bring with their specific expertise and experience. Some boards are therefore not receiving the level of support they need. There are no silver bullets, of course. We have been embarking, though, on a programme of work over the past few months to get a better understanding of these problems and consider how we address them. I know that my officials have worked closely with the NGA and a number of you as part of that process. As part of the work, we are looking at how we can articulate the benefits of effective governance support, particularly for school and trust leaders. We're looking at how we can identify a CPD career pathway for governance professionals, and we're looking at how we can better articulate the differing expectations of a governance professional in different parts of the sector. We aim to publish something, bringing this all together over the next few months. I hope that this will be an important step in the right direction. We are also looking closely at the developmental needs of governance professionals after the contracts for the previous programmes ended in March. We want to make sure that any new programmes genuinely meet the needs of the sector. In the meantime, many of our previous providers continue to deliver high quality training. I want briefly to return to the point about leaders. We cannot talk about the importance of the role of the governance professional to audiences comprised solely of governance professionals themselves. You already know all of this. So an important nut to crack is how we improve recognition at board level and among executive leaders. To embed lasting and sustained change, we need to get the whole sector to understand the value that an experienced governance professional like yourself can bring. I understand that this is one of the many things that are highlighted in the NGA's recent survey being published today. We will be looking closely at those findings. I feel very strongly that this is an area of work that can have a real, tangible and lasting impact on the governance sector. I want to see every board across the country being able to draw on the expertise of a competent governance professional, because that comes back to the fundamental importance of the role and the impact it can have when it's done well. So I want to end by saying an enormous thank you, though, to all of you for all the work you've done, particularly during this period of the pandemic, and for the value that you bring to your boards. I hope that you will find today's network meetings valuable, and I'm grateful to the NGA for their continued work that they do to bring the networks together. And as I say, I do hope that circumstances allow me to meet many of you in the future. Thank you so much for all your hard work.
Just made the same mistake as Steve. If we can, excellent, you beat me to it. Wonderful. So this is the time when we are going to bring in, oops, that's it, that's the one, our whole panel. This is, we hope, quite a carefully constructed panel in that what the well, I was going to say the survey shows, but actually we all know this anyway, don't we, from our many years of experience, that you as a profession are employed and self-employed in different ways, and that you provide your service in different ways, often to a range of schools. There has been some suggestion recently that you are two professions, one serving trusts and one serving maintained schools, but I think all the work that we've done and the survey in particular shows that that absolutely is not the case, that you are often the same people and that you often move from one sector to another, and that when we look at career progression, we may well find that actually moving to a trust is absolutely part of that career progression. So we have a panel of governance professionals who have served governing boards in a variety of different ways and modes. So what I'm going to do, and this is purely in alphabetical order, is to ask all 5 of our additional panel members to introduce themselves, but also to say, well, I've given 3 minutes response to the report. What did they think about it? What would they like to say? And any advice on how we really make change this time, rather than coming back again next year or the year after and having a similar conversation. So if I can hand over first to Emma Myers, who is the governance lead at the Woodard Academy Trust. Emma.
Thanks, Emma. So obviously I've been involved in governance for around 5 years now, and I think we all know that the landscape's changed significantly for those involved in governance over that time, and I think we all recognise that our role has become more varied and complex than ever. For me, the key findings of the survey and the report make it absolutely clear that we now need that structure of governance professionals that differentiates between the various roles and responsibilities. I think that having that collective description and that umbrella will elevate the profile of our roles. I think it will naturally open up career progression pathways, and it will create that much needed culture of recognising and rewarding experience and development. I think we can see from the report that those who are regarded as governance professionals, be that heads of governance, governance managers, or that title of governance professional, not only receive higher rates of pay, but we can see from the survey results that they feel more confident in their role and they experience greater job satisfaction and have greater opportunities for CPD. It was significantly concerning to me to see that over 80% of respondents had not provided services in any other governance professional role in another sector previously, and that the majority of respondents didn't see scope for progression in their role, and yet we've identified a clearly distinct lack of induction, training, qualifications or accreditation. So I think what we're highlighting here is there's an absolutely desperate need to improve the availability of and access to high quality training that links explicitly to career and salary progression. it was significant as Sam picked out that a number of respondents were actually unsure of what's out there or what they need. So I think we need far greater definition in that area. Overall, I think the report is absolutely fantastic, and I'm immensely, as a governance professional, immensely grateful to the NGA for everything that they're doing to raise the profile of our profession. But I think it would be, it's worth noting that it is disappointing to see that since the last survey in 2016, the progress on those fundamental issues hasn't been as significant as I think we'd have liked it to be. So I think linking to what Emma says, you know, I would say, as Sam said, we're a workforce of around 10,000 people. There are over 300 of us here today. And really, this is a call to arms, really, for us to use this report to raise the profile of a governance professional role, to work together to support the development of that career framework. I absolutely believe that our profession can be a rewarding one, and one that provides personal and professional development, but only if our value and worth is recognised by everyone involved in governance. You know, and I absolutely believe that this report and this movement towards a clerking framework will enable all of us involved to have purposeful and uplifting careers. So for me, it's my thanks to Emma and the team for the enormous amount of work that's gone into the report. But I think really the responsibility lies with us now in the profession to drive it forward. So thank you, Emma.
Thank you to Emma. And moving on to someone who's not called Emma, Karen Haynes, who is Director of Just a Sec Limited. We'd love to hear from you now, Karen.
Thank you very much, everybody. So there were things that highlighted to me from the report were similarities for my governance journey, which is over 20 years ago, and can relate to so many of the points raised and responses to the report. So the first one was my motivation for joining the profession, which was so similar to many others, that it was just for additional income, really. And, you know, I think that a lot of clerks actually fall into the role rather than it being a chosen career path, you know, and maybe there's an opportunity there to try and find ways to improve the advertising of the role and what the role and responsibilities are of the clerk. I was surprised at the number of clerks who only service one board. And maybe that is linked to other parts of the report with regards to confidence in the role, because I do find with the number of clerks that I work with, the number of schools and different types of schools and academies, and the number of meetings and actually gaining that experience can make a difference to that. Again, so surprised that induction isn't offered with over a quarter of clerks, and you know, I found that really shocking, really. I know when we induct a new clerk, you know, we have a one-to-one approach, which is then followed by supervision and a QA process. So that is obviously something that does need to improve. And I think, you know, the report refers to offering legal advice. And I think that's really quite frightening to a lot of people. You know, it is quite daunting because many clerks aren't legally trained. But I like to just try and explain that, which might assure some people, is that just by at the start of a meeting advising whether that meeting is quorate, you are actually offering legal advice, you know, so it doesn't need to be as scary as it might sound. I think with regards to remuneration, I think there is a lack of knowledge and understanding by some that, you know, the level of experience and also the number of hours that are actually put into a meeting, you know, and you know, that can cause conflict there. I agree with the term governance professional and some of the responses to the report. And I think just thinking about my governance journey, you know, whether it might suit more with a tiered approach, like what is suggested in the report, which would be dependent upon experience, qualification, and career progression. You know, so it could be, you know, some boards are quite happy with just a minute taker, you know, progressing up to a clerk to the board, and then possibly up to governance professional. I do think it's important for clerks to be servicing all committees, again, as highlighted in the report. I think it's important for continuity across all meetings and the minutes, but I do understand that obviously school budgets are quite tight and this can have an impact on this. I think qualifications was quite a big one for me. I undertook the National Colleges training some years ago, and you know, things have moved on quite a lot from there, and have undertaken other clerks training, but I think sometimes with the number of years experience and running and operating a governance service, you know, the training isn't always fitting to each individual's needs, you know, so I would recommend, you know, doing a bit of investigation and find something that actually suits your circumstances. And then I think, just to finish, I think one thing that's sprung to mind for me reading the report is that, you know, maybe a way forward would be a model clerks, governors, governance professionals induction policy that could be shared with schools, just to sort of raise that awareness. And I think a lot of points within the report could be improved, really, and maybe a starting point for this could be through the NGA's Find Us a Clerk. And then finally, just to say thank you to the NGA for everything that they do in supporting all governance professionals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. Really good to hear from you. And now we move on to our third panelist, Lucy, who's got a whole range of different experience as a governance advisor and is a chartered governance professional. But we know you, Lucy, mainly for the fact that you are it wasn't until I saw your bio, I saw you were actually our examiner for the level 3 accreditation. So I'd love to hear from you now.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me, and also for doing this report, which was great. So I've got, I think, one big point and one small point. I think the big point is to emphasize my agreement with the points you made about the range of skill and complexity in the governance professional role. And I think, you know, this can go from the administration of keeping, for example, attendance records updated on the school website, right up to really seriously difficult issues, such as advising your trust board or your governing body on areas where the DfE's own policy is hopelessly muddled and complex. For example, their policy on local authority associated persons, and of course, probably favourite for many of us here, the role of members in an academy trust. Both of which, to advise correctly and confidently, really require significant qualifications, I think, from some provider. You know, I'm not here to big up ICSA or Chartered Governance Institute today. I think that my second small point is I saw in the chat people saying occasionally what they really want is someone to take minutes. They only want minute taking. And whereas I appreciate that taking minutes is easier than that really high level advice to very senior people, I also noticed another couple of comments saying, you know, it's an art form. It's not just making a record of what everyone's saying. And I think this is a really crucial point about the skills required. Good minutes have to have two separate functions. They have to be proof against inspection. So that might be auditors, it might be Ofsted, and it might be a freedom of information access request. But they also have to be useful. You can't approach minute taking in a purely defensive way. They need to be a good record of discussion that people can go back to understand and to know what their actions are. So I think minute taking in itself is complex and difficult and requires a much higher salary than some of what I'm seeing quoted here. And I think my final point to make is to say that I do think we need some level of tiers as to what a governance professional is defined as doing. But I was also very interested in Karen's point that she made just a few minutes ago, which is that you really do need to be everywhere as a good governance professional. You can't just be kind of opining only at trust board level. You do need to be in the detail of at least some of those meetings to understand your stakeholders and to understand how decisions are being made. So I think that's another area of complexity, and I welcome discussion about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Really good to hear from you. And now on to Mandy Parsons, who you're purposefully wearing two hats, but I've just noticed on your bio, we've managed to conflate them rather. So you are co-chair of NCOGS, which many people may know is the National Organisations for Coordinators of Governor Services, but you also run the Hampshire County Council Service, which has an incredible amount of experience and in fact has been quite a trailblazer for clerks and clerks accreditation. So we're really pleased, Mandy, you could join us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm glad you've managed to clarify those two hats that I'm wearing. I want to respond firstly, as part of NCOGS, because NCOGS is that umbrella organisation with some 350 members who historically have been thought of as representing local authority governor support services, and many of those, as you know, provide traded clerking services out to schools. The membership is much more diverse now, so we have a lot of independent governance professionals, as well as small, medium enterprise companies that belong to that network and operate across our 9 regional hubs. So they're very passionate about clerking. They do a lot of work in that space, and they would welcome this report and recognise all of those challenges that they have in supporting clerks across maintained and academy schools. It's a difficult space to work in. Particularly difficult, I think, for independent clerks working in areas where local authority clerking support services have declined, because it makes it much harder for them to access CPD locally to them and to gain advice and support. So I think it is a very complex landscape, and I think the report findings recognise that and actually shine a spotlight on how diverse actually the clerking market is out in the across the country. I think the identification that one of the primary barriers to progression is to do with the understanding of the importance of proper clerking governance support in individual boards. If we could push that barrier so that schools were more willing to spend money in investing the governance professional and clerk roles within their schools, it would enable the profession to change shape. For example, I run a clerking service, so I'd like to say thank you to the team that run that service in Hampshire, because it's not actually me, obviously. And they do a fantastic job, and they've been doing that job for 20 years. We've had accreditation programme running for 20 years in Hampshire, and it keeps running whether the DfE fund it or don't fund it, because we believe passionately that clerks actually have a right to be equipped to do the job that we're asking them to do. And we do employ them, so we have all of those responsibilities as employers to make sure that they're trained right through from induction and have continual access to CPD. And I think that is an employer responsibility. And that responsibility ought to be conferred to schools where they directly employ clerks, that they have a duty to make sure when you employ somebody that they are properly trained to do the job that you're asking them to do, and that you actually understand the job as well. And that is one of the things that's particularly difficult for clerks, I think, that they're often overlooked, and the wealth of knowledge that they have often is hidden behind the pen and the piece of paper that they're writing on at the time. I think it's really important for clerking service providers to be able to embed those overheads into the pricing model for the services, because it does cost a lot of money actually to recruit, train, induct and continually support clerks, and to give them the employee benefits of sick pay and holiday pay and maternity leave and all of those things. But they're important aspects of growing a profession. The low pay rates mean it's very difficult for clerks actually to earn a full-time wage. So although the hourly rate equates to what might be deemed to be a reasonable salary, it's rarely achievable because they can't clerk enough schools to actually form a full-time job in terms of their working hours. So that's one of the real challenges in the sector. So in the clerking service that we manage in Hampshire, we employ approaching 150 clerks, which is a very large clerking service. In terms of full-time equivalents, it's not. It's about 15 full-time equivalent roles. There is a lot of part-time working, and that makes it a very complex profession or role to manage across the piece. I think it's really important that independent clerks recognise that they don't have all those employee protections and benefits, and they have to therefore cover the cost of their own CPD. So you would expect those rates to be uplifted considerably to enable them to fund access to proper training in CPD, including membership of professional associations that provide those things. So I think that's really important that they have that negotiating space to realise that when you're self-employed, you do have to have access to proper support and advice within your role. I think the qualification space is interesting. We expect all our clerks to attend CPD through the year. We expect our clerks to complete our accreditation programme, but I wouldn't like to see the qualification space become a barrier to entry, because I think a lot of people enter clerking from a very diverse range of backgrounds, and actually that diversity brings a richness to the work that they do in schools that would be unwise to lose. So we have people coming in who are ex-police officers, people who take an early retirement, so they're still young and they're still working for a long period of time in the second career space. They come into the service highly qualified. So I've seen in the chat people referring to the fact that they've got master level qualifications, they've got MBAs, and when you say to them, would you like a level 3 qualification? They think, not really, I'm not really into the piece of paper, but yes, I'd like to do it because I'd like to increase my knowledge in this particular role. So the qualification route needs to recognise that quite often the people entering the profession will be career changers. They've got high level qualifications, but they do need the technical knowledge around the legislation and procedural space, really. I think schools actually do really value clerking and governance professional roles. You know, when people want to join our service and there is a waiting list, they want to do it because they really know when you've been without a clerk, what a massive difference it makes to have a properly trained clerk sitting alongside you, and how much that reduces the workload, if you like, on chairs and other members of the board. So they do recognise it. The difficulty is getting them to recognise the value in terms of the amount of money schools will invest in what they see as a very part-time role within their individual school. So it's the amalgamation of pay across several schools that starts to make the difference. And when we push the prices up, there's a lot of squirming. And of course, CPD budgets for other professionals working in schools are equally challenged. And so schools make very difficult decisions around their spaces. So that is something collectively that we all have to keep winning the argument and working towards improving, I think. And I think that's all I want to say, really. Just that we support the work that the DfE is doing. We're part of that working party, and we do agree that the focus on clerking and governance professional roles is very important if this school improvement journey is going to continue and be well supported. So we're fully behind that campaign and that work. You're muted, Emma.
I know. You know what? I think I better not turn it off again. I'm no good at remembering to do it speedily. Thank you so much, Mandy, for that. And then on our panel, we now have Sharon Warmington, who is the founder and director of the National Association of School and College Clerks. You also have your own very extensive experience, but I imagine you want to also say a word as the National Association. So it's great to have you with us, Sharon, and over to you now.
Thanks, Emma. I really want to say that NASC is here to be the voice of clerks, and on behalf of clerks nationally, we are pleased to be able to respond to the NGA's report. We received it, like the other panel members, in draft a few weeks ago. So I recognise that some of the comments may have already been highlighted by previous speakers, but as it was embargoed back then, I only shared it with one other colleague internally because I wanted to make sure that the views being expressed weren't just mine, because I can tend to be quite opinionated in the nicest possible way, but I wanted it to be more than just my view on the report. So throughout the reading of the report, we had a number of questions as well as comments, but with 3 minutes, I'm going to try and summarise some of these. So as an organisation, NASC fundamentally supports any individual, school, trust, local authority or organisation that has a focus on raising the profile, the professional standards and the remuneration of clerks and governance professionals across the sector. However, we do believe that all three areas are inextricably linked, and therefore focusing solely on one or two of these areas will ultimately result in a failure across the one that's left out, which is usually pay. In fact, it was at the NGA's Clerks Conference in March 2020, just before the first lockdown, that NASC made a clear statement that a change of name and title does not reflect an increase in profile, standards or pay. And we continue to stand by this a year on. As it's taken 7 years, so from 2013 to 2020, for the NGA to put a price on effective clerking, the question is, how long will clerks need to wait for increases to be realised across the sector? The report clearly evidenced that 58% of the respondents are still being paid below the minimum recommended by NGA, and NASC would go further to state that our own 2020 report noted that many clerks are working below the national minimum wage. Another key area of concern to us is the intended audience of this report. Where does it go? And is there any measure in place for formal feedback from governors? Writing reports about clerks for clerks is like preaching to the choir. We already know because we responded. Is clerking embedded in other training events, conferences or online learning for chairs, governors and senior leaders? Do they truly understand the significance of having professional clerking and how their responsibilities to clerks needs to match our responsibilities to them? So in summary, NASC would like to suggest that in order to support clerks in our career journeys, that we focus on professional development rather than just training. In September, we will see the implementation of the Early Career Framework, which provides a structure of 2 years of professional development for teachers entering the profession. Why not create a progression framework for clerks to develop their practice, knowledge and experience, which is embedded in the fabric of the role and underpinned by the DFE as part and parcel of being a true governance professional? Thank you.
Hey, there we go, remembered. Thank you so much, Sharon. And I think you and indeed the rest of the panel have absolutely opened up a whole bunch of conversation that we need to be having, not just today, but in an ongoing way. And absolutely, we hope and expect and are directing this report to governing boards as well as clerks, and indeed there are some governors and trustees here today amongst you, but it's really important to get this absolutely further afield. And so when we move on to Ella after the panel, she will be talking about a new information sheet out today on exactly that point. It is aimed at chairs of governing boards, but you're so right, and I absolutely agree that we need that pincer movement from not only yourselves as professionals, but from boards, from NGA and from others. There were, the team has pulled a number of themes out of the chat for me. Thank you so much for participating. It makes the event really rich. There's quite a lot of comments there on pricing services, but I'm really conscious that actually the survey had quite a low percentage respondents of those who are self-employed. And I don't know whether any of you have any different figures. We're obviously conscious this is a self-selecting survey, and in the report itself there's quite a long section on methodology. So I'm not, taking that figure that we came up with as gospel, but it does point to the majority of those who are school and trust professionals now being employed first and foremost by the school or trust, and then secondly by local authorities. Sam, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. Thirdly, by independent agencies, and then fourthly, those of you that are self-employed, often are very experienced clerks and governance professionals who have chosen that route. So I'm slightly diffident to spend a lot of time on the panel talking about pricing, but it's clearly important for those of you that are self-employed. I just wanted to very quickly answer the couple of questions about national leaders of governance. You may not have had a chance to read the report from the NLG advisory group that reported to the Department for Education last year that I was on, and we recommended, and the department has accepted, that governance professionals should be considered for NLG status. So that door is open, and in fact today I probably should have thought about advertising that anyway. We had hoped by now to have basic information up on the website, but unfortunately we're just waiting for the contract to be signed off by the Department for Education. As soon as that's happened, NGA is the new provider of that NLG service. We'll start putting information on our website, so you will be hearing from us, but absolutely governance professionals will be entitled to apply for that role. So as well as that whole issue of how you price your services, there was also quite a thread going on in the chat about from those of you who actually did other jobs for schools and trusts, and the conflicts that might bring with it. I've certainly talked to the independent sector quite significantly about this, because they often use their bursars in independent schools, and they accept that isn't a good route. The bursars do actually have to report to boards, and it's very difficult to perform both functions. So I know I haven't really corralled that into sensible questions for the for you as a panel, but who would like to jump in on any of those issues? There's perhaps a theme there about how governance professionals take it upon themselves to make the case, particularly given the points that Sharon and others were making about actually if governing boards don't buy it, it's really very difficult. So any thoughts from you about whether you're doing it as an internal employee or an external self-employed? Lovely, Lucy, please jump in.
So I'll just come straight out and say I'm freelance. I only work for a certain rate, and I charge £550 a day for school governing services, and I am willing to go down to like a very tiny unit of time, you know, so I don't sort of charge per hour or part thereof. You know, I go right down to a few minutes so that the schools can feel confident about calling me for a quick chat, but I would not work for some of the rates that I've heard mentioned, because I think that the role is too complex for those levels of pay. And I can only extend my sympathy to those of you who are obviously doing a great job and whose employers are paying what I think is not a significant, not a sufficient amount of money for that role.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to join in that discussion? How can we make a difference? Sharon,
Yeah, I'm with Lucy. You know, and I'm very open with clerks when clerks contact me directly for advice and guidance on how to approach the issue of pay. I'm very clear. It doesn't matter whether it's a primary school or a secondary school. Clerking is clerking. Governance is governance. I work a lot in the private sector, housing, charity sector as well. And, you know, I'm happy to say to clerks, take your skills into other sectors where you can be appreciated more. But my mind, and this is me personally, rather than wearing my NAS hat, I think there should be a minimum level, irrespective of how many meetings or anything like that. I never charge by the hour or even by the meeting unless it's an ad hoc one. And my minimum start rate is 4,500 to 5,000 per annum. And it goes up from there, because it really is a professional service. But I think now the conversation needs to be had top down, as it were. So the emphasis needs to be put on educating governors, chairs, schools in what they should really be paying the only remunerated role around the table.
thank you. Emma, and you've recently moved, haven't you, from being external clerk to an internal clerk? So you must have been thinking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spent the last sort of 5 years working for an independent clerking service, managing a team of clerks, and then I've gone from that to being directly employed by an academy trust as their governance lead. And so I have a team of governance clerks who work across the academies, and it's really interesting for me because I'm going through a process of restructuring where I'm looking at appropriate gradings, appropriate role descriptions, but also making sure that those fundamental appraisals are sort of built into that system, that really my clerks are regarded as employees just as anybody else would within the trust, and they're not different because they only work a small number of hours or have a very defined sort of remit within the trust. So I think for me, I'm in that position using this report to inform that process. I think if you're sitting at the other end of the structure, then it's absolutely using this report and using these surveys and these results as your basis to be going forward and pushing forward what you think an appropriate structure, appropriate pay, and appropriate conditions needs to look like. And that needs to be, I think, as much as we have a responsibility to make sure we're embedding it down into our structures, depending on where you're sitting, you can use it actually as a basis for your discussions pushing up through the structures as well. And it's so disappointing to see the number of people who aren't paid anywhere near an appropriate salary or rate for what they're doing. But I think a lot of that comes down to ultimately a huge lack of understanding of what we do as governance professionals, and the sheer volume of work we do behind the scenes that isn't seen. So we absolutely have to start raising the profile that, you know, going back to the minute takers, we're so much more than minute takers, and we do so much more. And as Sharon's rightly said, we are the paid professional advisor around that table, and we need to really push that profile up as much as we can.
Thank you. Mandy, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think it, you know, as Emma said, she's in a position now to start to embed and influence those beliefs and those practices within the employment landscape across that mat, and that's a good starting point to do it. It's if you're working like I do across 540 schools, you know, embedding those messages is a long journey. So you know, we do a lot of work with chairs and clerks and heads coming together. We run, you know, chairing matters programs. We talk about the triangle of leadership across governance. The barrier is always the school budget and the pressure on CPD for professional staff in school, all professional staff in school, not just the clerks. So it becomes easier if you can move towards, I think, having more full-time roles, because that, you know, that reduces the amount CPD per head. But of course, the profession has a very wide range of people working in it, and all of them enter the role for a myriad of reasons, and they're all perfectly valid reasons, and they do a very good job. So, you know, I'm nervous of a move that pushes out all of that flexible working practices that clerks really value, and they value it because their personal circumstances fit very well with the role that clerking can provide in schools. So I think we have to value the strength that's in this network, as well as look at ways of pushing that per hour rate upwards, and making sure it's inclusive of a right actually to proper professional development. I'd just like to say on that the qualification is an interesting debate, because I think, as in all roles in whichever profession, that the gaining of a qualification doesn't always lead to better pay, because the roles are defined by what an individual school or board perceives as its need. So what that qualification route might do is enable you to move on and get bigger roles in different settings, not necessarily more pay in the setting that you're currently in. So, you know, that's one of the other factors I think that we have to think through when we're thinking about progression.
Thank you, Mandy, and that's a really good link back to career progression, because I would like to move on from pay to career progression, and we have literally, I think, depending which clock I look at, 4 minutes left for our panel. But I was just noticing a couple of people in the chat feeling a little bit down about the fact that we haven't made as much progress as we should have done, and absolutely we felt like that as well when we first saw the results. And that's why I think, as excuse me, Emma called it a real call to arms, and we're going to treat it as such, and we hope that others will too. And there were then a few responses saying, yes, we need to keep pushing. So some of you who know me know that I'm always promoting the framework for ethical leadership in education, and one of the virtues we have there is optimism. So I would like us, if we can as a panel, to finish on that note of optimism, but particularly looking at the idea of a framework for qualifications, for career progression. And Mandy, you made some really important points about us needing to be flexible there. And I noticed there were comments about gender earlier on. You can see from this panel, we are a very female occupation, and flexibility is important to all, but historically has been very important to women as well. But sadly, it might also explain why the pay has not been what it should be. So if I give you each sort of 30 seconds to comment on what you would really like to see from a career framework, so that in a year's time we're not having exactly the same conversation. Emma, shall I come to you first?
That's unfair, Emma. I get less time to think about it. I think for me, one of the things that actually it goes off into a different area is around networking. You know, it's been picked up in the group actually around having that professional network around us. I've been incredibly fortunate to work for an independent service provider that surrounded me with like-minded professionals with a wealth of experience, and a company that had a very clear people strategy on moving individuals forward. I think on the other end of the scale, it can be a very lonely and isolating role. And I think, like we've talked about, working part-time, not necessarily a full-time vocation, it's a part-time profession. I think we need to do more to network. I think we're stronger. The sum is greater than the parts, isn't it? I think we need to do more to network together as a group of professionals.
Thank you. And Karen.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I think for me, like I mentioned earlier, I think there's a bridge to be made between recruitment and induction, and I think that's really important. And I think an induction policy can cover a lot of the aspects that have been raised within the report. So for me, I think that's a positive way forward.
Thank you. Lucy.
I think for me, the thing I would most like to see considered in any kind of tiered solution is how difficult and how important writing good minutes is.
Thank you. Mandy.
Yeah, I'd like to think that where governance professionals or clerks are employed by an employer, that those employers take that responsibility seriously, that they do recognise that they absolutely do need proper induction, they need training to be confident and successful in the role, and they need access to a reasonable amount of CPD through the year, and that the move to that being embedded at school level would therefore enable independent clerks working in the sector to have those same expectations and to charge accordingly. I would like to see really the clerking profession move away from a sort of begging bowl DFE dependence, so that we can only have training when they're funding it. I feel that famine and feast approach to clerk development is actually unhelpful. I think they're absolutely right to be in this space and to be trying to drive recognition of the importance of good governance support. But I feel that the sector itself ought to be recognising that and owning the responsibility to provide that career development as they would for other professionals working in the education sector. I just worry that the DFE give you a bit of funding, everybody, develops programs, they award contracts, they deliver them for about 18 months, and then all of that disappears, and we are where we are with clerks not really having access. So the journey has to be to embed that actually as a right for people working in this space, that's not dependent on the begging bowl approach. That's how I feel.
Thank you, Mandy. And Sharon.
I'm very optimistic about the future, but that's how I tend to live my life, really. Working in governance across many sectors. I'm still in the education sector. That's where my heart belongs. And I think as a group of people, being clerks, we support each other. And I think if we continue to do that and pull up as we rise up, that's the motto that I have in business, that it's not about, well, I get paid this and I'm okay, but I'm happy and NASC is happy to support any clerk wanting to have that conversation with their schools about how they can properly increase their pay, properly increase the standards in which they're working, and their professional development.
Thank you, Sharon. And then the last word to Sam.
I'd very happily echo Sharon's optimism. We have good reason for that. We're going to get some leadership from the department on this. We've got their forthcoming document paying more attention to roles. But aside from what the department can do, we've also got a receptive audience here. We know that schools are good at talking about pay, about workload, about conditions. So we know when we get stuck into the right conversations that these arguments won't fall on deaf ears. We've just got to start the right conversations at the right time with the right people to really get somewhere. And hopefully this report is a good starting point for getting those messages out there loud and clear to school leaders, to governing boards, to think again about giving the profession its dues, basically.
Thank you, Sam, Emma, Karen, Lucy, Mandy and Sharon. It's been really, really good to have you join us. And this dialogue, I think, as you've all said, is going to continue. We will make sure it has, but I think it's been really helpful, certainly for us, I hope for the audience as well, to hear your words of wisdom. So thank you for that. And I would absolutely like to just finish by echoing a couple of comments I just saw right at the bottom of the chat now. I think Mel Stokes, it was you that said, let's turn these voices into an avalanche. I thought that was great. And Laura also made the point that actually volunteering as a governor has really added to her CPD. And that's a point that we make all the time with other educational professionals, with our educators on board. So you're absolutely right, it applies here too. And that builds on Sam's point that the DFE are very good at talking about other members of staff's workload and well-being and pay and conditions and development at the moment. And we need to get governance professionals plugged into that. But I absolutely hear your warning, Mandy, about, but we don't want to have a begging bowl and only develop when the department pays us to develop. You're absolutely right. That is not sustainable. We need to embed that within the profession. So thank you very much. And we are now turning to Ella, who is our Knowledge Centre manager, to talk to us about the new piece that we have just produced to say to chairs of governing boards, please take your governance professionals serious. There will be more coming in the next weeks and months. But Ella, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. So I wanted to take the opportunity today to give you a brief update on some of the work that we've been doing on the Knowledge Centre overall. And then, as Emma says, I'm really going to focus on letting you know about a piece that we've published today, which specifically draws on a lot of the points that we've been discussing. But I'll move on now to that first slide, please, Charlotte, before we get into some of that detail, which is just to point out, if you attended the Clerks Conference a couple of months ago, we talked about a few goals for our Knowledge Centre. I'm pleased to say that we're making progress on all of those. The first of which here is about curating resources that are easier to find. So we're just sharing a link there and a preview. You're for some of the first to see a new sort of destination page for resources that will help you to navigate what we have to offer. So that's the first update. The second update, if we move on, is around providing accessible resources and practical guidance, which is obviously what you've asked us for and what all our members want to see. So just touching on new resources, that second point there is the guide that I wanted to focus on to talk to you about today, but I've put an example of some of the work that we've been doing. But just to focus on that second point there, recognising your governance professional, a guide for chairs. So this we published today, and I hope my colleagues will just pop a reminder of the link in the chat. This guide is published alongside the report that you've heard so much about today. And whilst it's a guide that we've published, which is aimed predominantly at chairs, it's equally a piece that you could use to support conversations with others. And indeed within it, we encouraged strategic conversations between the chair, the rest of the board, and in particular with senior executive leaders, in order to initially, first and foremost, have a conversation which is about understanding the role of your governance professional, and particularly evaluating what support you really need from your governance professional. That's what we talk about as the first step in this guide. We then go on in the guide to talk about evaluating, okay, having understood your needs, are those being met? What does the role look at the moment? And are you best utilising the support from that professional? So that's the first step that we've recommended there, is having that strategic conversation initially with the right people about the role of the governance professional. Within that guide, we then go on to talk about, okay, having understood that, what are the ways in which you can recognise and support the role of your governance professional? And I'm pleased to say that many of these elements have been talked about extensively within the chat today and within the panel. So we talk about providing an appropriate job description and title that's based on the board's needs, the committee's needs. So once you've got that appropriate job description and title in place, obviously it becomes much easier to have some of those really fundamental conversations. So we talk about the importance of carrying out an annual appraisal, and we talk about what that might look like and some of the fundamental elements of those annual appraisals, who might carry them at those appraisals out. And then we go on to talk about pay. And again, it's sort of getting those building blocks in place, because once you've got that job description and title in a good place, once you're having those annual appraisals and other discussions throughout the year, it becomes easier to have those discussions about pay. And whilst clearly it's become very, well, it's already obvious to all of you that there is no one size fits all approach. There is no guide that says this is what you should be paid. Obviously, that's going to vary between context, settings, individuals and experiences, but we have made some suggestions that might provide some helpful support to those who are setting pay and to support those conversations that you're having. And finally, within the guide, we then go on to talk about the importance of induction and ongoing CPD. We talk about, and again, this is aimed at chairs, but others in a similar role. We talk about what that might look like. And this is certainly something we're talking more and more about NGA at, not only induction for governors and trustees, and we've recently produced more guidance around that, but actually how can we better support you? And we've heard that loud and clear today. So that's certainly something we'll be taking on, but that's a starting point to have that conversation around induction and around ongoing CPD. So I think that brings me to the end of my session. Just briefly to say, there's a note on the screen there about the importance of making sure you're signed up to our newsletter, and you may want to encourage those you work with to do the same, perhaps members of your boards, and there's a place to do that within the account management area of the NGA website.
If I can bring our meeting to a close, first of all, by thanking all of our contributors today and for everything that you have contributed as well as an audience. Some really excellent points, some powerful messages about our collective voice, and a great deal of optimism, as has been said. I think we have a basis to move forward and give this profession the recognition and status that it truly deserves. We have a part to play, but we can't do it on our own. We need you, we need your support, we need your expertise, and we're so pleased to hear that and read that you're going to get behind us to do that. So thank you for another great networking meeting. Have a good day, have a good week, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon.